very weak and debilitated. I think it was the only time in my life that, for sure, that I ever felt that I wouldn't have minded dying. I could have given up the ghost quite nicely. The doctors and the nurses on the ship, of course, were quite decided that we weren't going to die on them. And so they made us active. Although we really had no energy and were quite happy to stay in bed, if we felt an urge that we needed to go to the toilet, there were no bedpans. We just had to get up and get to that toilet, even if we felt very weak. And once I was feeling a little bit better, I could see the trouble that I must have had and the other fellows must have had in getting the only exercise we got, really, was to struggle from bed to bed. You sort of make a lunge from one bed to the other and hang on to the bed because you couldn't stand hardly, and make your way to the toilet. The best one I saw, I suppose, was one young fellow just crawling along the floor. He went on all fours to the toilet and only just made it. As we passed by each bed, we get a few encouraging words from the occupant of the bed. If he was feeling well enough, he'd say, "Go on, mate, you can make it." Our ward had quite a lot of beds, so I suspect that there would be quite a few venereal diseases in the ward. And so it was rather amusing to think that each day we had to give a urine sample. There was a row of jars on a shelf with our names on it. And the first 2 or 3 times that I went down to the toilet and had such a struggle to get there and urinated, and then remembered that I should have placed a specimen in the jar, probably saw another fellow using his jar. But my technique for that was to take a little drop out of 3 or 4 of the other jars and pour into my jar and have a little mixture there. I top my jar up quite nicely. And I wonder whether they had ever tested it, because no one ever came to me and said anything, or whether I don't think I had any different treatment to anyone else. But eventually, of course, I was feeling better, and I remembered what I should be doing before it was too late. Eventually, we returned to the Dewdale, of course, and there was no official welcome for a few motor mechanics coming back on board. The flotilla officer, Lieutenant Ball, didn't greet us with an apology and say, "Well, I'm very sorry I accused you of malingering." And we just went back into our duties as usual. And my memory of Sub-Lieutenant Place, the engineer lady, or officer, he came along the deck one day, and I was stripping down one of the carburetors. So in fact, I had it all in pieces. I had it spread out on the metal deck lid that usually covered the engines. You have to pull it to one side to work on the engines. And the stoker who looked after the engines on that craft had asked me about carburetors. He said, "How do they work?" And I thought, well, the best way to show that, mate, is to strip one down for you. So I took the thing to pieces, all the jet set and all the float mechanism, and had it laid out neatly on the steel plate. along comes Sub-Lieutenant Place, and quite upset to see this carburetor strewn all over the deck, as he thought, I think. And he took me to one side and said, look, he said, you can't do that sort of thing. You put that back together again, he said, and never do that ever again. So I suppose it was mainly because I'd been my own boss and I was used to just doing what I thought was the best thing to do, and with an officer on board of rating isn't allowed to do these sorts of things. During that time in Freetown was the only time in the 6 years and 4 months I was in the Navy that I grew a beard. It was rather silly, I think, in a way, to grow a beard there because it's such a hot climate. And if you ever, anybody who grows a beard would know how itchy and irritating it feels. You have to put in a written request to the captain to grow a beard. Only the wording of the request is not, please may I grow a beard, but please may I stop shaving. So I had the beard for 3 or 4 months, and then put in a request to the captain to start shaving again. The other thing I did in Freetown, which I didn't do at any other time, I was on the lower deck, and I was on the lower deck, 3 years or so. At that time I drew my type of rum, and this was because it was getting near Christmas, and naval ratings, of course, aren't allowed to have any liquor aboard, and there's no canteen with beer or liquor of that kind during my time in the Navy. So we were keen to celebrate Christmas in the only way we could was to get a bit plastered. And we realized that the people issuing the rum on the ship, because it was a sort of blue ensign ship, and the captain was RNR, and the rest of the crew were sort of merchant navy and that sort of thing, to sort of not really pucker navy, and they had nothing to do with the issuing of the rum. It was the flotilla officer, Lieutenant Ball, who was a Lieutenant RNVR and didn't know much about King's rules and regulations, I imagine, which states specifically that as the rum is issued, it is drunk. You're not allowed to go away with it anywhere in a corner and drink it, or to slip it into a bottle each day and fill a bottle, which is exactly what we realized because of the slack discipline in regard to these regulations. We would be able to do that. So I had more than a bottle of rum by Christmas 41, and so did some of the other fellows. And we had quite a carry-on at Christmas time with a sort of ship's concert, and I suppose if there was any disciplinarian aboard, they turned a blind eye to it. But the bad thing about bottling rum, because the rum is so strong, I don't know what the proof of the rum is, but is quite a high alcohol content, is that, you can kill yourself if you drink too much of it. And this is exactly what happened to 3 ratings. I think 2 of them were on one of the destroyers, and one was on one of the other white ensign ships that was in port at the time. And they must have been able to store up some of their rum and drank so much of it that they died. We were still going out to sea and joining up with a convoy every so often and fueling the ships at sea. This, of course, we were fueling the Navy ships, the destroyers, which, because they're running about the convoy and chasing off to drop depth charges every so often, did a far greater distance than the convoy did, and needed a lot more fuel. So we'd take along with them and top up all the escort vessels, corvettes or destroyers or sloops or cruiser or whatever it was. And that would have been great. Goodness knows, we would eventually, I suppose, have gone off to Madagascar. But during these sea voyages out of Freetown, we had trouble with the valve springs of the engine. The ship's engine's valve springs were breaking. Something wrong with the steel in them, because it wasn't just one spring, it was quite a large number of them. The only way the engineers on board the ship could keep the engines working was to rig a good spring above the broken one. It was impossible to dismantle the engine without stopping it. And the ship then, of course, would have had no power and would have been lying at the mercy of a submarine, perhaps. But they were able to, from the top of the engine room, suspend a spring, and with a lash-up of steel wires and ropes and things, they were able to keep the valve operating of the broken spring. And they ran out of gear in the end. They just ran out of enough gear to keep. They had 5 or 6 or 7 or 8 valve springs gone, and they just didn't have enough gear to keep the engine going. So that was a real problem, and I think that's the main reason I didn't go to Madagascar. The ship was ordered to go to Gibraltar, and we went to Gibraltar with one destroyer as escort, just the Goodale and this one destroyer. And quite a distance from Gibraltar, we had to stop, and they had to change some of the valve springs because they hadn't any more lash up to keep the engine going. So the Goodale wallowed in quite a nice Atlantic swell. It's quite a long swell in the Atlantic usually, and the wave of the swell is quite high, and so the ship was rolling quite a bit. And the destroyer, of course, was circling us and at quite a distance. And if it picked up the sound of a submarine, or thought it did, it would go chasing off towards where it thought the sub was and drop depth charges. And it dropped quite a lot of depth charges, which we could feel on the ship. And it's a little bit disconcerting when you feel the shudder of the ship, because presumably if a torpedo hit it somewhere, you'd feel a shudder too. And it's not very pleasant. You feel quite lonely if you're the only ship there. At times the destroyer nearly disappeared over the horizon, nearly out of sight. So it's quite a lonely feeling, and you know there are enemy submarines maybe about somewhere or other.